Hi, everybody. I wanted to take some time to share a little bit about some of the Northern Renaissance art that you looked at in your slides, just so you have some background on it and maybe some analysis of some of the images that you looked at. So first off, a little bit of background on Northern Renaissance art. We're using this term Renaissance because, definitely this is a movement that's participating in some of the same themes, some of the same ideas that we saw in the Italian Renaissance. However, there's also some differences. There are also some differences. For one, Northern Renaissance art is influenced by Renaissance humanism. Certainly, we're going to see this in the way that the Northern Renaissance treats a figure like Erasmus, but also with the ways that Protestantism, which itself, as we've talked about, was a movement that was connected with humanism. The ways that Protestantism comes to engage with some of this work. At the same time, they were less interested in classical forms. So Renaissance artists in the North were very much interested with some of the ideas of the past, but there's less of an emphasis than we see in the South on things like classical architecture and to some extent things like mythological scenes, although we'll see exceptions to that. They were less interested in the North in techniques like chiaroscuro and sfumato. So some of the shading, some of the atmospheric perspective that we saw in the South. It's not that it's absent in the North, but they tended to favor clearer, brighter lines rather than that kind of shading. Another thing that we see that's a little more dominant or a little more prevalent in Northern Renaissance art is their notion of the proverb, essentially wisdom that comes through in their painting. So that in a number of these works, we see a kind of moralizing tendency, meaning that there's a moral to their work, or there's a sort of a pithy, sort of concise statement that could be made about life by looking at their work. We'll see that in a number of these works. And then finally, you see the development of what we call a genre scene, Genre. And in this context, what a genre scene is essentially a scene from everyday life. So while there are certainly religious subjects and there are certainly sort of larger than life subjects that are captured in Northern Renaissance art, just as often we see some of these artists just engaging with everyday scenes from the lives of everyday people. And so we'll look at some of those as well. Now, the first artist that we're going to look at is Hieronymus Bosch, who is perhaps the most important, certainly one of the most notable artists from the North, Netherlandish artists, working in the early part of the 16th century. And this work, of all the works that Bosch created, his Garden of Earthly Delights is far and away the most notable, far and away the one that has piqued the most scholarly interest for a number of reasons. First off, in terms of its form, this is a triptych, which is a three-paneled work. You see the two panels on either side that are framing a larger central panel. This could be closed so that the two panels on the sides could fold over, and it would essentially be a closed box that would then open to reveal this scene. You often see triptychs in places of worship. In this case, it was a commission for a stateroom, so a secular commission as opposed to a church one. However, the iconography here, the work, the imagery does seem to, at least to some extent, be religious. We could probably speak for hours if we were in class together discussing some of the things that you see in this work. I would encourage you to really spend some time looking at it, and to really spend some time thinking about what you think is going on here, because it's, again, certainly a work that has aroused a lot of scholarly interest, a work to which there is maybe no end of questioning. One interpretation, or sort of a popular interpretation, is that Bosch here is in some ways interpreting, or in some ways rendering, maybe three planes of existence. We may look at it as a kind of paradise over here on the left, almost a Garden of Eden type type setting, where you have a Jesus figure with an Adam figure and an Eve figure, perhaps bringing them together kind of at the moment of creation. This might represent a sort of what we would call pre-lapsarian or pre-fall version of innocence, version of peace. Nevertheless, there are some unsettling things even in this work. Some of the architecture that he renders is a little bit is a little bit unsettling, is a little bit ostentatious. There's also some there's sort of a bit of satire maybe in that there are dead animals here, which is not something we often think about when we think about life before sin. So Bosch might be sort of making a statement about, even in the Garden of Eden, even in this state of innocence, sin was right around the corner. Death was right around the corner. And in fact, Bosch had a lot to say about the world in which he lived, about the ways that human beings hurt each other, about the ways human beings sinned against each other. And he may be pointing to the fact that even in this state of innocence, that was around the corner. When we look at the second panel, maybe there's a lot more ambiguity in the sense of what is going on. It could be that this is different interpretations have said, this is the world we live in now. It's a world of decadence. It's a world of people pursuing their desires, whether those desires have to do with, gluttony. You've got sort of the fruit, the large fruit imagery, people eating and drinking to their heart's content, whether pursuing their desires is of a sexual nature. There's certainly just a lot of, we might say, licentiousness in this work of that nature. And we can see a progression maybe from the innocence of the first panel to what happens when human desire, when sin, when quote unquote earthly delights are unleashed on the world. Some of that strange architecture, even kind of menacing architecture that we saw in the first panel, has proliferated here. Certainly there are a lot more people. There are some grotesque images of animals and people. And as I said, it's a dreamlike image. It's a surreal image. One of the things that always strikes me about this work is just the astounding fact that this was created over 500 years ago. If you were to show me this work and say, this was created in the 1960s, it would make perfect sense to me. It almost looks like an album cover from the 1960s or something like that, sort of a psychedelic work. And yet this is a work from the early 1500s, which it kind of speaks to Bosch's prodigious imagination, but also his view of the world and his view of maybe the decadence that he saw in the world. Finally, we look at the third panel, which was maybe less ambiguous. It's dark. We're not just in a state of things being menacing here, but downright terrifying. This is certainly a hellish landscape, so that perhaps this is a movement from paradise to an earth that is marked with sin, and then sort of its culmination in hell. There are a number of images here that could be dissected. There are some almost, demonic animals, demonic creatures, along with just some really strange creatures. You have these ears with a knife protruding from them. You have this kind of bug bird-like figure, essentially sitting on a toilet, eating people and, expelling them. You've got creatures, you've got a figure here, which is a human-like figure that is kind of on all fours, and yet the back half of his body has been removed. And this figure is looking out at us. Many people have pointed out that this resembles Bosch's face. This could be a self-portrait. So make of that what you will. There are a number of musical instruments and people even being tortured on musical instruments, which may be another statement about decadence, pleasure, and the ways that we pursue these things to our demise. So an enormously fascinating work. Again, I would encourage you to spend more time with it. Just spending some time looking at the colors, looking at the images, thinking about what Bosch might have been thinking about in his imagination. But also there does seem to be a moral here, which is in keeping with Netherlandish works. this idea of avoiding luxury, avoiding decadence, and perhaps in the process avoiding the punishments of hell. A very different sort of work comes to us from Caterina van Hemesen, a much more understated work. This is her self-portrait. She distinguished herself as one of the foremost portrait painters of her time, one of the foremost female artists of her time. This is from the middle part of the 16th century. She was young when she produced this, roughly 20 years old. And yet what she seems to be sort of indicating here is a seriousness. This is not out of place when it comes to kind of the influence of Protestantism on the world in which she lived, and a sort of moralistic self-seriousness, an approach to life that was maybe seen as somber. That's reflected in the colors in this work. It's reflected in the expression on her face, just the diligence, the seriousness with which she is approaching her craft. So that's Caterina van Hemesen's self-portrait. An artist that we'll spend a little bit more time with is Peter Bruegel the Elder. And Peter Bruegel was another 16th century painter in the Netherlands, painting really in the middle part of the 16th century. We're going to look at two of his works. And the first one is called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. Now, I had mentioned earlier that Northern Renaissance artists had a little bit less interest in classical themes, mythological themes, and classical architecture. This is maybe an exception, right? This, of course, is a story from classical times. It's a story that's from Greek mythology, but is maybe famously retold in Ovid's Metamorphoses. You read it in 101. It's the story of Icarus. It's the story of Icarus and Daedalus, who were being imprisoned on the Isle of Crete, and Daedalus decided to make some wings so they could escape. And when he did, he told his son, "Don't fly too close to the sun, or you'll melt. Don't fly too close to the waves, or you'll drown. Instead, stay in the middle." Right. So very much a message of moderation. You don't go to extremes. But of course, if you remember the story, Icarus, as most of us would, was so excited with the business of flying that he flew too close to the sun. His wings melted, and he fell into the water. Now, it's interesting what Bruegel chooses to focus on in this work. Notice he calls it Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. The focal point here is not the mythological narrative of Icarus. Certainly, Icarus has a place here, but you'd be forgiven if you didn't see it. Icarus's legs are down here, kind of in the bottom right of the painting. He is drowning. At the same time, look at everything else that's going on. You have a boat that's sailing by. You have a man on the shore who may be noticing Icarus, but is just as likely maybe, fishing or casting a net into the waters. You have people up here on the cliff that are farming, taking care of their sheep, looking the other direction from this business that's going on down here with Icarus. The point that I think Bruegel is making is that life is not made up of sort of the impetuous actions of someone like Icarus. Maybe these larger than life stories are sometimes should be relegated to the background. What is important is the work we do, the faithfulness at the tasks before us, whether that's looking after our sheep, whether it's farming. And Bruegel seems to be rendering this work for that purpose, to communicate that moral to people of his own day. Be faithful in the little things. Be faithful in the work of ordinary life. As we might even notice the furrows here, the plow that the plow is making as a kind of symbol of the work that we do, and of being diligent, of looking forward, looking ahead at what we're doing, rather than being distracted even by, but being distracted by the folly of youth as Icarus was, or even being distracted by the sort of showy events that are happening around us. Otherwise, we can see, just a masterful rendering of landscape, a lot of detail, naturalistic detail. And also, again, to contradict somewhat something I said earlier, some use of atmospheric perspective, some use of shading. You've got the clear, bright lines up front, but in the back, Bruegel is he is an artist who engaged in some atmospheric perspective, so that these mountains in the background, this landscape in the background, this town is rendered more distant by the way he depicts it. I wanted to share with you along these lines a poem that was written in the middle of the 20th century about this painting and what it means. This is written by William Carlos Williams, one of America's most famous 20th century poets. And he was a poet of the everyday. He likes to comment on the everyday things that were in front of him. He also wrote the poem "So Much Depends Upon a Red Wheelbarrow" that you've maybe read before. But I'll read this poem out loud just as a comment on this poem and on the moral that Bruegel was maybe communicating. According to Bruegel, when Icarus fell, it was spring. A farmer was plowing his field. The whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling with itself, sweating in the sun that melted the wings' wax. Insignificantly, off the coast, there was a splash quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. Again, Williams picks up on that moral as well, this notion that the events of the Icarus story are unnoticed in this work. Instead, what people are consumed with is the work in front of them, maybe to good or to bad, right? I mean, there is a sense in which maybe there's a lack of compassion here. No one notices Icarus drowning. But the point is that sometimes sometimes the major things that are going on are sort of swallowed up in the everyday. Another work by Bruegel that we want to look at is his Peasant Dance. And this is an example of a genre scene, right? This is an example of a work that just depicts everyday life. This would be the sort of celebration, the sort of get together that would happen in villages in the Netherlands. So you've got people coming together, eating, drinking, taking a break from their work and enjoying life. You see a couple of things here. Again, naturalistic rendering of the landscape, of the surroundings, of the architecture, of the people. One of the things Bruegel does really well is depicting movement. You can see it, for example, with the dancing here, kind of in the middle left or middle right part of the painting. You can almost picture the swirling and the movement of these dancers. As some scholars have noted, Bruegel might also be making a comment here on the fact that in the midst of this everyday celebration, what's in the background? It's the church, which is certainly a comment on the fact that the church was always there in these people's lives, but also maybe a comment on the fact that they were kind of ignoring the church in this moment. They were consumed with their lives of celebration, their lives of frivolity. So there may be a moralizing tendency here as well. Another artist that we want to look at is Albrecht Dürer. And Dürer is a German artist who was working really from the later part of the 15th century into the early to middle part of the 16th century. One thing that we notice, this is his self-portrait. Certainly there's a seriousness to it. Certainly there is almost a transcendental quality to it, an otherworldly quality to it. A lot of detail in the facial features, the hair, certainly the depiction of his hands. You can see every detail of his fingers and his knuckles. But we also see definitely the influence of someone like Leonardo da Vinci here. Leonardo certainly seems to have been, he was a contemporary of Albrecht Dürer, and they certainly seem to have been maybe shared in each other's work, and Dürer was certainly influenced by Leonardo. You can see that triangular composition, the gaze of something like that we saw with the Mona Lisa, which is a work that was actually created around the same time as this. but definitely the influence of Leonardo is at work here. Now, one of the things that Durer is known for, in addition to his paintings, is his woodcuts. And this was a way of mass producing his work. He would create these prints by engraving the image onto wood and then imprinting it onto paper. And he was able to he would be able to create these editions, these multiple images of his work. The most famous example of this is his Apocalypse, sort of his interpretation of Revelation, which was the first book to be designed and published by a single artist. So if you were to have been fortunate enough in the 16th century to purchase to purchase this Apocalypse, or to procure this Apocalypse, what it would have included is a full text in Latin and German of the book of Revelation. And then it would also include illustrations. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is one of the most famous of those illustrations, in part because of how it displays just Durer's mastery of detail, his mastery of a kind of dramatic rendering of a scene. You'll know this is not entirely realistic. It is an allegorical work. I mean, it's a depiction of Revelation, so we might expect that. But it's very detailed. You have sort of the emaciated horses, or the emaciated horse that Famine is riding on. You have, the movement of the figures. Sorry. Depicted by these lines, these horizontal lines that are cutting across. The rays of sun coming from the upper left-hand corner, which seem to speak to maybe the presence of God in this work, that what's happening here as the four horsemen of the apocalypse are being unleashed on the world, as judgment is coming to the world, as figures like this bishop or perhaps pope are being judged here as human beings are in misery, that God's judgment is coming. And that would have certainly been a terrifying notion, as it is today. But Durer was an artist who was quite capable of rendering that all of that drama, all of that emotion in his work. Another work that is profoundly emotional and profoundly realistic, and in fact, the realism here is almost staggering, is Matthias Grunewald's Crucifixion. And this comes from a work called the Isenheim Altarpiece, which was also a triptych. What you're looking at here is the central panel of the triptych, which features the crucifixion. And just a few features of this. First of all, the realism. You have the depiction of the human form in agony. I mean, you can see Jesus's ribs. You can see, his muscles being strained, and as he's in pain here. One of the features of this work that I think has always been the most profoundly realistic, but also gut-wrenching to me, are his hands, and the way that his fingers are almost writhing in pain as he's nailed to the cross. So there's a lot of just, again, profound, almost upsetting realism here. You also have some of the features that we've come to expect in a crucifixion. You have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Apostle John to one side of the cross. Mary Magdalene with her jar of ointment, as she's often depicted as one who anointed Jesus's feet. Also there at the foot of the cross, so Jesus's most loyal friends, most loyal devoted followers. And then over here to our right, you have John the Baptist, who of course was not present at the crucifixion. If you know the gospel story, you know that at that point, John the Baptist had been beheaded, so he was not alive at this point. But he is pointing to Jesus. He's holding a text, perhaps the scriptures, and he's saying, "He must become greater, I must become less." So that is sort of John's famous statement about the exaltation of Jesus. And what's so interesting here is the moment at which this is being said, right? In the Gospels, John spoke those words, "He must become greater, I must become less," at the beginning of Jesus's ministry, when Jesus was beginning to gain a following. Here, it's at the cross, it's at the crucifixion, as if to demonstrate that this is what it means for Jesus to become greater. It means that he dies for the sins of the world. This is what it means for Jesus to be the Savior. It means suffering. It means agony. Again, just a beautiful, powerful, but ultimately gut-wrenching scene. You also have, of course, the Lamb of God that we've come to associate with John the Baptist, because John also said that Jesus was the Lamb of God who would take away the sins of the world. And of course, that's coming to fruition here. So uh, just a work of extreme realism, a work of profound beauty, but also a very difficult work in a lot of ways. One last piece. This is a portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger, an English artist, known primarily for his, I'm sorry, he's a German artist, known primarily for his portraits. And one of the one of the things to note about this piece is how it depicts Erasmus as a just as a classical humanist, right? So unlike a lot of works in the Northern Renaissance, this one does seem to be very interested in classical themes. This is maybe the most intensely humanistic work in terms of classical humanism that we've looked at. Of course, Erasmus is a Christian humanist. He's someone who was immersed in study of ancient texts, and that's depicted here by this book he's holding called the Labors of Heracles, the stories of the labors of Hercules, which is maybe a comment on Erasmus's own work, that he's a kind of Hercules of his time, fighting battles of reform against the church and trying to make the truth known. You of course have other symbols of learning books, a beaker here, or a flask, pointing to maybe scientific learning, a pilaster or a column here to our left, Erasmus's right, which of course depicts is another callback to classical humanism. And the way that Erasmus is depicted here is someone who is at peace in his studies. He's someone who is maybe a scholarly gentleman, really the best example of a classical humanist that we can imagine. So these are just a few of the works that you looked at, or these for in the Northern Renaissance, and just a few thoughts on the works you looked at, I should say. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope that this was helpful.